Rod, Low Carb Down Under, thank you once again for inviting both of us to speak. Belinda's speaking tomorrow. And I can't really explain to you how proud I am of the fact that we are, as a husband and wife, able to speak in forums and for her work to be recognised along with mine. It's been an interesting journey for us both. Look, our health system has turned into a sickness industry. And how did we, as healthcare professionals, actually allow this to happen? We know that the benefits of a low-carb, healthy fat lifestyle are an improvement in health and a reduction in medication for many. So why and who is blocking that message? And those industries that have much to lose have actually been influencing our medical education for a long time. And that education has been failing both the patient and the doctor. And it's actually not about the science, and it's never been about the science. So let's expose the red pill story. So I want to present the case of the big food and the pharmaceutical industries' complicit activity on our international health disaster. Big food educates us on what to eat, and pharma controls our education on what to prescribe and how to treat. And those activities extend back over 100 years. Gary this morning looked at history, and we're going to take that back even another layer. And Peter talked about those industries, those associations, and I'll be talking about how they're actually complicit and conflicted. So the question is whether or not they were well-intentioned, or have they hijacked the entire show? So this talk is about understanding the origin of our education, and you alone can then decide what you're actually going to do with that information. So guidelines actually create the illusion of knowledge. And we as doctors have succumbed to following guidelines written by those with vested interests. We have a fear of stepping outside the guidelines, and it's really interesting that David Unwin's observed that amongst us as health professionals here in Australia. We have a fear of challenging. Surprisingly, much of what we've actually been taught in medicine is actually not science-based. So I'll make the argument that medicine, as we've been taught, is more about art than science. Art is open to interpretation. It is non-science. And our guidelines are based more on opinion rather than fact. And non-science is actually nonsense. So much of what we have been taught is a house of cards ready to collapse. Most education, and particularly medical education, works on the principle of read, repeat, and be rewarded. And most health professionals are very good at that. To read and then question is a path less travelled and comes with a different reward. And that's been my journey for many years. So are you ready to question your education and your teachers, and at what price? I have been a victim of disinformation for decades. Have we all been led astray? But now I know why. So the greatest health issue on the planet today is non-communicable disease. We are getting fatter and sicker. The complications of obesity affect every organ of the body. Childhood obesity is out of control. And there are escalating rates of obesity, diabetes, dementia, cancer, and almost every non-communicable disease. And it's within a lifetime, it's not genetic. This is our work future. And as a result of our health, we have an economic disaster bearing down upon us, and it's only going to get worse. And we're dragging down the environment with us. Topsoil is now the greatest agricultural export on the planet. And our farming practices are to blame, and that's related to our dietary guidelines. And we're actually exporting our health into the oceans. So what's to blame for our health crisis? Is it the food we are not supposed to be eating, or is it the food we've been told to eat? Have we been completely conned? So is medicine a science or an art? Is it the right or the left side of the brain winning out? I'm going to argue that biochemistry is science. It's as pure as it gets for normal cells. And the Krebs cycle, which I often come back to, is how a normal cell converts essential proteins, essential fats, and non-essential carbohydrates into acetyl-CoA. And acetyl-CoA is the fuel of our mitochondria, just like wood is to a fire. The acetyl-CoA is converted into ATP, the energy of life itself in every form. That's science. So we're familiar with the bell curve and how things vary as we move away from the midline, and nearly 1/3 of people fall outside of 2 standard deviation groups. This becomes a massive confounding variable considering that guidelines are drawn up for 2 standard deviations. So 1/3 of the population fall outside of what guidelines are actually supposed to be applied to. So how we live as individuals is the exact opposite of a laboratory-controlled experiment. Evidence by association is just art. Biochemistry is science, and how it is then applied to the population is art. Can you believe the opinion of a healthcare professional that cannot actually work out the answer for themselves? Or have their opinions based on funding dollars? For decades, medical education has been eminence-based rather than evidence-based. It is increasingly hard to question guidelines and authorities, and as a result, guidelines are suffering under the weight of that inertia that we're all part of. Science has become biased. The scientific method is steeped in tradition, but every step is now conflicted by bias. Preconceptions, funding, experimental design, observer bias, right through to publisher bias are the norm. I'll actually argue that the null hypothesis may now be null and void. There's been a corruption of the scientific process, and most claimed research findings are false, with the majority of research not able to be reproduced. Our reliance on the scientific method is at best on shaky ground. Bias has turned science into an art. It's one of my favourite quotes. Voltaire was trying to tell us that medicine is an art in the 18th century. The art of medicine consists in amusing the patient whilst nature cures the disease. Medical education is far and away focused on investigating and treating sickness rather than keeping us healthy. It's reactive rather than preventative. We spend infinitely more time and money treating the sick rather than being rewarded for keeping people healthy. So we need to look at the history of modern medical education to work out where we are now. When did the pharmaceutical and food industries take over our education? And our current problems lie in history books a century ago. The very early 20th century saw a battle in the US over the medical education model. John Rockefeller of oil and Andrew Carnegie of steel were 2 of the wealthiest and most influential people of the time. They commissioned Abraham Flexner to change the medical model away from patient education to patient medication. In comes William Osler. Osler was one of the fathers of modern medicine. He promoted patient-centric care and was commenting about the management of obesity in one of his textbooks about carbohydrate. It became a battle over medicine being an art or a science. It was a battle over educating or medicating. Osler encouraged the masses to not take medicine. Osler knew that medicine was an uncertain art. He was patient-focused rather than disease-focused, and he strongly felt that education came from the bedside and not the laboratory. Flexner had an agenda. He visited 155 medical schools in the US and Canada, sometimes only for a few hours. Flexner was criticised for his superficial survey and cavalier attitude. He omitted the dynamic between patient and physician. Big money actually won out. The Flexner report was adopted by the US Congress in 1910. So what did that mean for medical education? The following years saw the closure of 50 medical schools, down from 131 to 81. The Flexner report was the broom literally sweeping through the system. The Rockefeller-Carnegie-Flexner model was adopted by most of the remaining medical schools, with Rockefeller pouring enormous funding into the institutions that came around to the Medicate model. The early 20th century was an exciting time for the development of drugs. The prevention model was put to the side, and with that came the birth of the modern-day pharmaceutical industry, one that continues to shape clinical guidelines in medicine today. A bit more history exposes where the food industry started educating us. Nutritional science is nonsense. It has little, if anything, to do with the scientific method. It is about improving the palatability of food, searching for that bliss point. It's about improving the shelf life of food, the transportability, and the profit. And nutrition science has rarely actually been about health, but we as health professionals have fallen for nutrition science being called science for a long time, and actually 102 years ago next week. So the birth of our modern food guidelines actually started in October 1917 with the origin of the American Dietetics Association. The ADA became the model for all Western dietetics associations. The ADA was started by a protege of John Harvey Kellogg. The processed food industry was right there at the beginning. Leonard Cooper wrote the textbooks that were used for dietetic and nursing programs around the world for the next 30 formative years. She was educated by the cereal founders. She was a vegetarian, practicing the teachings and beliefs of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Our current cereal-based anti-meat guidelines come from a religious ideological base that had nothing to do with science and was all about salvation. So let's take a jump to now. Where is our medical education coming from? And what are the big food and pharma up to today? So most general practices in Australia use medical director or best practice software. Much of the back-end resource material has been very kindly supplied by Kellogg's. Just look, it's there. It's been pushed down a level in the last 12 months following its expose of it in 2017, but it's still there. Our current Australian guideline to healthy eating is cereal and grain-based, rapidly evolving into vegetarian vegan. It is definitely not LCHF. It's littered with processed food. It's loaded with energy-dense, nutrient-lacking refined carbohydrate. Throw in the inflammatory seed oils and wash it all down with junk food and alcohol. And if you don't follow the guidelines, you get reported to the medical board. So who gets to write the dietary guidelines for Australia and arguably of the Western societies? Well, the Dietitians Association of Australia has been given that contract for some years. In the same time frame, the DIA has been in a contractual agreement with the cereal industry to promote the benefits of sugar and cereal to the Australian population. Let's think about that. Coca-Cola has been health washing its sugar beverage for decades. It's the longest running sponsor of the Olympic Games dating back to 1928. When you hear the term exercise as medicine, realise that it's actually been trademarked and can be traced back to Coca-Cola, the first founding corporate partner of exercise as medicine. And when you hear the latest fad medical term lifestyle medicine and its multiple international brandings, then realise it has its current influence from Coca-Cola funding. Lifestyle medicine is popping up everywhere, but it does have its origins primarily with the Seventh-day Adventists promoting their vegan agenda and with the help of Coca-Cola in recent years. Just be very aware of the influences in your education right now. Many proponents of vegetarian diets quote the China study on the benefits of taking meat out of the diet. Very much anti-LCHF. So without going into the flawed epidemiology, methodology and cherry-picked data, these three men came together to make it all happen and then promote it. T. Colin Campbell, Junsi Chen and Alex Malaspina. The China study is a big business. Junsi Chen is still highly influential in developing health policy in China and Southeast Asia. And Alex Malaspina is now retired but was a senior vice president of Coca-Cola and worked for them from 1969 to 2001. Malaspina was also the founder of ILSI. The China study anti-meat propaganda message suits the processed food industry very nicely. So what else is influencing us? And Peter talked about the American Heart Association. They're heavily involved in medical education and developing guidelines for heart health. They receive nearly $180 million in corporate sponsorship each year, and $33 million of that comes from the pharmaceutical industry. And the rest comes from a variety of sources, including the food industry. On to the American Diabetes Association shaping guidelines. They've certainly been influencing diabetes education for decades. 6 of their top 10 funders are pharmaceutical companies donating more than US $1 million every year to this advisory group. They are all peddling drugs for diabetes management. How do you think they feel about low carbing, reducing the need for medication in diabetes? Look, I just want to touch on a couple of topical areas around low carb. Firstly, where does low carb and keto fit into society at present? So I want to consider the dietary evolution of an individual. Many people are eating garbage and poorly, and ill health is upon them. They decide to eat by the food guideline pyramid, cereal-based, but unfortunately soon take on the shape of that food pyramid. The smart ones work out that eating real food is actually low carb, healthy fat, low in and with the right amount of protein for age and activity. The hardcore that have some specific health agendas move to keto, and many more are embracing the carnivore diet. There's a group of people that embrace a vegan lifestyle at present for a variety of reasons. Unfortunately, that requires supplementation, is often nutrient poor, leading them to be sicker. Embracing a full fresh food diet turns them back to at least LCHF and hopefully back to meat. The vegan movement is clearly gaining notoriety, but are they actually aware of where their propaganda comes from? The anti-meat agenda is driven under an animal rights banner and on questionable environmental statistics. I encourage you all to get knowledgeable about the environmental factors here, particularly around meat production. That's beyond today's talk. But how many vegans understand that the basis of their diet is from the Garden of Eden diet, promoted by the Seventh-day Adventist Church for salvation and not health? And that group just happened to be the originators of the cereal, soy and fake meat industries of the world. Big food and religious ideology have a purpose-driven agenda. The vegans have become their foot soldiers. We've been told that we're getting fatter and sicker because people are not following the food guidelines. You've all heard that, haven't you? People are not doing as they're told. When we've actually been following them, and we've been doing it for 50 years. The classical food guidelines are cereal and grain-based, anti-red meat, focusing on a transition to vegetarian. So over the last 45 years, we've been advised to increase our cereal and grain consumption. That's just more non-essential carbohydrate. Our protein intake has gone up due to nuts, peanuts and poultry, but our red meat intake has decreased significantly. We've increased our intake of fruit and vegetables and decreased dairy consumption, as we've been advised. And in the developing world, we've convinced them to increase cereal consumption and have little meat and virtually no dairy. The only trouble is that following those dietary guidelines for the world has been a total failure for preventing non-communicable disease.